You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmeswaran from Washington, D.C.
Good to be back with you, Prashant. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. So for our listeners, as we tape this podcast, we are looking at the signing of an agreement between the United States and the Taliban that could potentially be the key to ending over 18 years of war in Afghanistan since the December 2001 invasion by the United States. This deal has been some time coming now. So we're taping this podcast on Friday, February 28th, and the two sides are supposed to meet for a leap day signing on Saturday the 29th in Doha, Qatar, where the Taliban has been based for a while, and talks have been happening between the two sides. So the deal on the table right now is basically the culmination of a long process that began going back to really September 2018 after the unveiling of the U.S. strategy for Afghanistan. Zalmay Khalilzad, the U.S. Special Representative, had worked on negotiations with the Taliban Political Commission for a long time. Last September, September 2019, right before a deal might have materialized at Camp David in the United States, President Donald Trump in the United States called off talks with the Taliban after a U.S. soldier was killed, and that led to a long period of uncertainty. But in the last few weeks, we've seen things coalesce now again to a political process. And most significantly, the two sides have been successfully, fingers crossed, we have a few more hours left before the signing takes place, but have successfully pulled off a cessation of hostilities. There have been some attacks in Afghanistan, including in Kabul in the past few days, but the Taliban has not claimed responsibility for those attacks. So all signs point to a signing of this agreement. And for listeners who haven't been following this, the basic contour of the agreement pertains to this. So the United States, after the signing, will reduce troops in Afghanistan with about a 3,000 to 4,000 troop reduction from about the current levels, which are at around 12,000, to around 8,600, which is what the Trump administration was at when it entered office in 2017. And in exchange for that, the Taliban will... I think the key to this is really going back to the reason the U.S. invaded Taliban in the first place in 2001, which is Afghan soil being used by terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda to conduct attacks against the United States. In 2001, of course, that was the September 11, 2001 attacks against New York City. But the Taliban will make a commitment to not allow their territory or Afghan territory to be used by such groups. And after that, they will begin, and this is the really tricky part, begin a process of talking to the U.S.-backed Afghan civilian government for a broader political transition in Afghanistan that will bring the Taliban into the fold to participate politically. And that's where things get really dicey. So that's just a little bit of an overview, but there's a lot more to talk about here, Prashant. I mean, tomorrow we do see the signing, and then what happens after that, I think, is going to be really unclear. So perhaps a good place to start is to talk about really the prospects of containing the violence between not only the Taliban and U.S. forces after this deal is signed, but also between the Taliban and the Afghan government. There's a real issue there. A lot of the specifics about how the two sides are going to come together and talk are still very unclear. So what are you watching for in the days and weeks that will follow this leap day signing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of summed up the significance about it pretty well, and also some of the uncertainties, which is, at least on two major fronts, we'll still be waiting to hear what actually this will mean and what effects and implications this will have. So on the one hand, it's the actual events and developments on the ground. So even previous to this, with respect to the negotiations, given the dynamics that we've seen in the past 2 years, folks have been really looking and seeing, whether it's, U.S. forces being killed or civilians being killed, whether anything could kind of scupper the agreement or actually derail it. But then I think the second big question, which you alluded to, is, really what are the agreements that the Afghans can reach among themselves, right? So we've had a dynamic where we're not only dealing with the Taliban and the Afghan government, but following the Afghan elections that have happened earlier this year, disagreements even about who has won that continue to be playing out, and divisions in the leadership more generally. So without those two things actually happening, we really won't have a clear idea about what the significance of this agreement is. And then, of course, there's all these other factors and variables that we've talked about previously on the podcast before with respect to Afghanistan, whether it's the U.S. election here that's happening in November, and whether we have a second Trump administration or a different administration, and the role of various external actors as well that might complicate dynamics there.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the political challenges within the Afghan government, because I think that's a really significant factor here. So September 2019, I talked a little bit about of course, the complete disappearance of the prospective deal that was meant to close with the Taliban at Camp David. But that month also saw Afghanistan host presidential elections. The turnout was quite low, but the results were finally announced earlier this month, with the finding being that Ashraf Ghani, the incumbent president, being narrowly reelected. He won a little bit over 50% of the vote, but the result was contested by Abdullah Abdullah, who was the chief executive officer in the National Unity Government. Now, for listeners, there is, I think, we have to go back to 2014 to really understand the origins of the current disagreements between Abdullah and Ghani. So in 2014, there was also a contested election in Afghanistan, and the Obama administration had to intervene very directly. Then Secretary of State John Kerry flew to Afghanistan and brokered effectively a unity government between Ghani and Abdullah. And that unity government was never particularly as effective as it could have been, because the two sides did have their own camps and their own sort of networks of loyalty and patronage within the government and outside of the government, which led to a variety of difficulties in efficiently governing the country. And now we see a very similar process playing out, with Abdullah Abdullah making his own announcements for cabinet members, really kind of looking to fracture the legitimacy of the election itself. And one of the questions here is that the Trump administration is so focused right now on closing this deal with the Taliban that it seems like we're not going to see the kind of intervention we saw in 2014. It just doesn't seem like it's a priority right now for the administration. There are efforts to get the Afghan government to coalesce around Ghani, given that he did apparently win more of the vote, according to the Independent Election Commission of Afghanistan. But this, I think, sets up a major problem for what happens after this Leap Day deal. Because if the Afghan government is internally not stable enough, it's difficult to see how these talks with the Taliban are actually going to begin. So I don't really see a clear answer to how this is going to play out between Ghani and Abdullah right now. Do you see anything differently?
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think this sort of captures the dynamic that we see, which is, even as we have this sort of the talk of the peace deal, the signing going on, there's really a lot of anxiety about the extremes of what could happen, whether it's political disagreements that might actually undermine the deal, or just a full out descent into civil war, infighting, and anxieties about the Taliban and how that affects the broader sort of regional balance of power. And I think the sort of nervousness that you sense is that on the part of the United States, there is an incentive for the Trump administration, and President Trump himself has said this, that he always has had a desire for the United States to withdraw and reduce its presence from Afghanistan eventually. And that only adds to the anxiety, I think, among some folks in the region. And, even if you just take a view of Afghan history itself, that if the United States is too eager and is too quick about, trying to draw down its presence and affect regional dynamics and the situation in Afghanistan, even when the domestic political dynamics are so fragile, that might be a complicating factor. I think we've already seen, public reporting even about Zalmay Khalilzad and how he's had to sort of say, sort of mention to the Afghans, hey, listen, put your differences aside. We need this deal to come through, which is fine if you're trying to get the deal. But if you're actually looking for this to stick and be sustainable, that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, there's just so many ways that I can imagine things going wrong after the signing. Another factor, and this has of course been an issue during this ongoing reduction in hostilities this week. But another issue is, what if we do see attacks on U.S. forces by Taliban fighters, right? So one of the problems that's I think been apparent since the death of Mullah Omar, the original leader of the Taliban, has been the fracturing of the organization itself. The Taliban's ability to command and control all of its forces, or all of the fighters who pledge allegiance to the Taliban leadership, has been, I think, strained, right? So if there is a major attack And this is what happened in September. There was an attack that killed a U.S. soldier, which ultimately led to Trump calling off the Camp David process that was supposed to culminate in a deal back then. So if there is a signing and something like that happens, it's not unimaginable that Trump will react to that incredibly poorly and it might derail everything. I think a factor maybe pulling against that is that, we are in an election year in the United States, and I don't think it's really an exaggeration to say that if this deal does end up leading to a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, potentially by, let's say, October, just days before the election, that could manifest in what would be the Trump administration's most significant foreign policy accomplishment in many ways. Pulling troops out of Afghanistan after 18 years of war is something that certainly Barack Obama tried to do. But if Trump is the president that actually pulls this off, that's obviously going to be incredibly significant. And of course, with everything happening in the financial markets and the economy not looking so hot, it might be more pertinent than ever for Trump to get this win in Afghanistan. So it might be the case that even if we do see a resumption of violence, potentially in the summer, as the summer months heat up, violence in Afghanistan tends to spike. But even so, the Trump administration might be politically motivated to make sure that this deal is, quote, successful by whatever metrics they'll be measuring for. Another issue maybe that's worth talking about is, something that's left unsaid in this entire process of the negotiations with the Taliban is the kind of political future that Afghanistan is looking at, right? First of all, even though, let's imagine that Ghani and Abdullah managed to reconcile their differences either with a 2014-style unity government arrangement or simply some other sort of reconciliation, that might lead to Ghani simply taking over as president without Abdullah's involvement. That seems hard to imagine right now, though. But let's say that happens and negotiations do begin between the Taliban and the Afghan government, right? So this is several steps down the line and making several generous assumptions about the state of stability. There are still questions about what kind of country Afghanistan will ultimately be, right? When you have the Taliban becoming involved in national politics, things like human rights, women's political participation, the very nature of whether the country will be an Islamic republic or an Islamic emirate like the Taliban had in the 1990s, many of these questions will have to be addressed. And this right now doesn't seem to be something that the U.S. is particularly concerned with. The American concern is to reduce violence, lead to a withdrawal of U.S. forces. But that, I think, is going to be something that certainly regional players in Asia, including, let's say, countries like China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, India, many of these countries surrounding Afghanistan who increasingly have stakes in what happens after the U.S. withdrawal are going to be paying a lot more attention to. Certainly it's going to be a very, if this does open a new era of geopolitics in Central Asia and South Asia, that's something that many of these capitals are going to be watching for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the point there about, broader issues and what peace looks like in Afghanistan and the management of conflict, is an important point. I think, there have been some inroads that have been made on issues like women's rights, minorities, and the like over the past 2 decades. But this all risks being undermined under the sort of Taliban-led government, or if we see Afghanistan, sort of decay into division and war. And those are the very issues that, to your point earlier that you made at the outset, the real negotiations and deal will have to be made between the Afghans themselves. And that is essentially where the challenge lies. So in some ways, the sort of prelude to an agreement that is being signed is only the beginning of a very sort of longer term process by which, the domestic situation in Afghanistan is actually being affected. And as you correctly pointed out, this is also going to affect how regional players are actually factoring into the conversation.
Yeah, and another thing for the U.S. is how do you get the Taliban to actually uphold their commitment to peace in the long term, right? What is to say that the Taliban play ball, U.S. troops begin withdrawing rapidly, first down to 8,600, and then even further by the U.S. presidential elections. And then if the Taliban renege and simply end talks with the Afghan government, push back on the deal entirely, let's say they don't actually break the assurance to the United States on allowing terrorist groups to use Afghan soil, that is, I think, a very difficult problem. And I think one of the ways to reassure that, I think there's a couple answers to that, right? Like the U.S. could be clear about the fact that if the Taliban do renege on participating in a political process with the Afghan government in good faith, then the U.S. would again use military force to, let's say overthrow a Taliban regime if it did come to that. I don't think the Trump administration is going to make an assurance like that public. I mean, especially before the election, right? I mean, the U.S. Public doesn't want the United States to withdraw from Afghanistan while making threats to the Taliban with red lines that would, again, lead to an invasion of Afghanistan. Another solution could perhaps be the U.S. Brokering some kind of regional process by which, let's say, the governments of Pakistan, China, Russia, India, potentially Iran, if the U.S. can, stomach that right now, all come together and state that they would like to see this deal last and they would like to see a political process between the Taliban and the Afghan government. That sort of an assurance could, again, create enough space and enough backing for the process itself. But unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen given the pace at which things are happening right now with the U.S. side really just pushing to get troops out as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, and I think that is really a major concern, because if you do have the sense that a U.S. administration was actually very committed to finding this sort of regional diplomatic solution, and this was also something that, I think there were some who were advocating this position during the Obama administration as well, that diplomatic energy needed to be invested. But those individuals claimed the same thing that is sort of happening now, which is essentially there isn't that level of commitment and energy to a wider diplomatic process. Essentially, the question really boils down to a narrow one of, how can we withdraw the U.S. presence? How can we sort of, kind of paper over the cracks and find a way to leave, which isn't historically, isn't a very sustainable way to actually sustain this, because the fear and the scenario that, one of the scenarios at least that is likely to come to pass is a scenario where Afghanistan descends into violence and the United States would actually have to intervene, or there would be a vacuum essentially, and the United States would be left kind of wanting relative to that earlier presence.
Yeah, well, I guess the only thing to do right now is to wait and see what happens. I mean, there'll be certainly, I think, enough early indicators of how successful this process is like to be in March and April. And certainly, I'm sure, this won't be the last that we're talking about Afghanistan on the podcast. But I think we'll leave it there. A little bit of a shorter episode today. But yeah, by the time listeners are listening to this podcast, the deal will have been signed in Doha, Qatar on Saturday, February 29th. I made a joke on Twitter that the U.S. doesn't have a great record of signing significant agreements on leap days. In 2012, you had the leap day agreement with North Korea, which was again signed on February 29th and fell apart by April. So hopefully the Taliban leap day deal goes a little bit better. But yeah, we'll certainly be back to take stock of how things are going in Afghanistan. But Prashant, it's good to be back with you. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Great. So for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you've been a subscriber or a listener for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, you can do that on either iTunes, Google Play, Spotify. It really helps the show and helps other people find the show. So we really do appreciate that. This week actually does mark the 6-year anniversary of the Asia Geopolitics podcast. It's hard to believe that we've been going for that long, but really wanted to thank all of you who've been loyal subscribers. It's always a pleasure to run into loyal listeners of the podcast anywhere in the world, from Europe to Asia when I travel. So I really hope that you'll continue listening to the show. And as always, if you have suggestions for me and Prashant for how we could improve the show or topics you'd like to hear us cover, just send either of us a note. We're very happy to take that into consideration. And finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. So thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.